In the iron-cold March of 845, when the Seine still carried great slabs of ice grinding down from the frozen forests of the Ardennes, and the first pale crocuses dared not yet open beneath the walls of Paris, 120 dragon-prowed longships, flying the black raven banner of the half-legendary Ragnar Lodbrok, came ghosting up the river like a nightmare made wood and iron, their oars wrapped in wool, so no splash betrayed them in the night. Their round shields hung along the gunwales, painted black so the ships themselves vanished against the darkness, their prows carved into snarling dragons and serpents that seemed to taste the air for Christian blood, carrying 5,000 of the hardest, most scarred, most merciless Danes and Norwegians who had ever drawn breath on the fjords, men who had already burned Nantes on Christmas Day 7 years earlier, who had wintered on the island of Noirmoutier and roasted Frankish monks over slow fires, who had sailed up the Loire and the Garonne, leaving nothing but ash and widows behind them, who had learned that the once mighty Carolingian Empire of Charlemagne's grandsons was now a rotting carcass, fought over by 3 squabbling brothers, Lothar, Louis the German, and Charles the Bald, each too busy stabbing the others to guard the rivers, and that Paris, the royal city, the city of saints and kings, the city that called itself the New Rome, lay open and defenseless on its island in the Seine, like a virgin asleep with the door unbarred. And so on the morning of Easter Sunday itself, March 29th, while the bells of every church in the city were ringing for the resurrection of Christ and the faithful crowded the narrow streets, singing the paschal hymns in clouds of incense, the first Viking keels scraped the mud beneath the Grand Pont. The war horns made from aurochs bellowed their harsh guttural challenge, and 5,000 pagans poured ashore with axes bright as winter stars and torches already lit from the pine resin pots they carried, and within minutes the suburb of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois was a roaring furnace. The abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, where kings had been buried for centuries, was stripped of its golden reliquaries and its screaming monks. The nunnery of Sainte-Geneviève saw its virgins dragged by their braids into the dragon ships. And then, in an act calculated to break the spirit of every Christian soul who watched from the city walls, Ragnar, if indeed it was the historical Ragnar and not one of the many chieftains who would later claim his name, ordered 111 Frankish prisoners taken in earlier raids along the river to be hanged from the branches of ancient ash trees along the left bank, hanged slowly, deliberately, in full view of the battlements so their kicking feet and bulging eyes and the creak of ropes could be seen and heard across the water, while ravens, sacred to Odin, wheeled overhead as though summoned by the god of hanged men himself, and Ragnar stood on the prow of his great ship Fafnir, his long braids whipping in the wind, his mail shirt glinting like fish scales, and laughed a laugh that carried across the river and into the nightmares of every child in Paris for generations, and then, whether by the direct wrath of God, or by the Vikings deliberately poisoning the wells with yew berries or nightshade, or the rotting corpses of plague victims, as some terrified monks later swore, a great sickness fell upon the Frankish army that Charles the Bald had hastily gathered on the right bank. Men began to vomit black bile in the morning. By noon their limbs were purple and swollen. By vespers they were dying in heaps, screaming for priests who themselves lay dying, and Charles, standing on the walls of the Cité in his purple imperial cloak, watched his army dissolve like salt in water, watched the dragon ships rocking gently at anchor, watched the hanged men turning slowly in the wind, and knew that God had abandoned Francia. And so he sent heralds under white banners to the Viking camp, offering first 500 pounds of silver, then 1,000, then 3,000, then 5,000, until finally, after days of haggling conducted across the river by shouting priests and pagan heralds, Ragnar accepted 7,000 pounds of silver and 5,600 pounds of additional gold, the single largest Danegeld ever paid in the entire Viking Age, enough hacked silver and melted church bells to fill 20 longships to the waterline, enough to buy entire kingdoms in the north, and only when the wagons of treasure had been rowed out under guard, when the monks of Saint-Denis had wept as their cathedral plate was broken up with axes, when the last sack of hacked arm rings and reliquaries had been stowed beneath the rowing benches, did Ragnar raise his hand, the war horns sounded the recall, the dragon ships turned their prows downstream, and the Vikings vanished into the mist, leaving Paris half-burned, its monasteries gutted, its riverbanks lined with corpses swaying gently in the current, its king humiliated before all Christendom, its churches ringing 40 days of mourning bells for the pride that had invited the Northmen, and the name Ragnar Lodbrok, whether real or already half-myth, entered the chronicles and the nightmares of Europe as the man who hanged Christians for sport on Easter Sunday and made the grandson of Charlemagne pay 7,000 pounds of silver simply to be left alive, a ransom so colossal that it would echo through the centuries as the moment when the Viking Age stood at its terrifying apex and the heart of Francia learned that even the city of saints could be bought, sold, and left in smoking ruins by pagans who worshipped the god of the hanged.